The first sound was the splintering of a lie. Glass erupted from the front window of the Redemption Gulch Savings and Loan, showering the street in a crystalline explosion that glittered like cruel diamonds in the high noon sun. Then came the shouting, a raw-throated chorus of fear and command that tore through the town's sleepy afternoon drone. Inside, the air tasted of gunpowder and panic. Eliza Hart stood frozen by the teller's cage, a reluctant statue in a tableau of violence. Her dress, a pale blue calico meant to project innocence, felt like a shroud. This was her role, the one Red Jeb had assigned her, the distraction. She was to be the doe-eyed girl, lost and flustered, asking for directions to an aunt who didn't exist. Her soft voice and gentle confusion, designed to lull the bank's single aging guard into a state of polite complacency. It had worked perfectly right up until the moment Jeb and his men, their faces hidden behind dusty bandanas, had stormed through the door. Nobody move. Jeb's voice, usually a silken, charming baritone that promised safety and whispered lies, was now a jagged blade. It cut through the whimpers of the customers huddled on the floor. He moved with a predator's grace, his long duster coat flaring behind him as he vaulted the counter. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the symphony of chaos. She was supposed to shrink into a corner to play the part of the terrified victim. But as the teller frantically stuffed banknotes into a canvas sack, her eyes met Jeb's. There was no recognition in them, no hint of the man who had once promised her a world away from her own meager existence. There was only a cold, possessive fire. He owned this moment, and he owned her. The illusion of control shattered when the old guard, a man named Silas, with a grandfatherly mustache and a spine forged from prairie steel, decided he would not be a footnote in another man's story. Instead of raising his hands, he dropped behind his small wooden desk. The roar of his antique shotgun was a deafening cannon blast in the confined space, a sound of righteous fury. Buckshot tore through the air, ripping a ragged hole in the wall just above the head of one of Jeb's men. That single defiant act was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Jeb's men returned fire. Pistols barked their muzzle flashes, illuminating the swirling dust motes in hellish strobes. A woman screamed a high-piercing shriek that seemed to go on forever. The air grew thick and heavy, the metallic tang of blood mingling with the acrid smoke. This was it. This was the moment she had been praying for, the crack in the facade of her gilded cage. While every eye was fixed on the desperate exchange of fire, Eliza moved. She was not a fighter, not a hero. She was a survivor. She backed away slowly, melting into the shadows. Near the entrance, her movements as silent as a prayer. Her hand went to her throat, her fingers closing around the cool, familiar weight of the silver locket that hung there. It was her anchor, her only link to a time before the lies, before the bruises that bloomed like dark flowers on her skin, before Red Jeb. She clutched it tight, the intricate floral engravings pressing into her palm. As the chaos reached its crescendo, Jeb shouting orders, the guard slumping to the floor, the world dissolving into a blur of smoke and terror, she turned and fled. She burst through the shattered doorway and into the blinding sunlight, a ghost escaping a tomb. She did not look back. She ran, her cheap shoes slapping against the boardwalk, the sounds of the botched robbery fading behind her. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she kept going, driven by a fear so profound it eclipsed all physical pain. She ran past the blacksmith shop, the scent of hot iron and coal dust filling her nostrils. She ran past the saloon, its batwing doors swinging idly, as if oblivious to the violence erupting just down the street. She ran until the last buildings of Redemption Gulch gave way to the vast, unforgiving expanse of the open plains. The locket in her hand grew warm, a small silver sun against her skin. And as she ran, the desperate rhythm of her feet pounding the dry earth seemed to beat in time, with a memory, a ghost of a happier moment, forcing its way through the terror. The sun was warm, not cruel, filtering through the leaves of a tall cottonwood. A checkered blanket was spread over a patch of green grass by a meandering creek, a scene of impossible peace. He was with her, his smile easy and genuine. Jebediah. Not Red Jeb the outlaw, but the charming, smooth-talking man who had found her waiting tables exhausted and invisible, and promised her stars she'd never dreamed of seeing. He had produced the locket from his waistcoat pocket, its silver catching the light. "For you, Eliza," he'd said, his voice a soft murmur. "So you always remember that you're cherished." He had opened it for her. Inside, nestled against the velvet lining, wasn't a space for her picture, but a tiny folded photograph. He had carefully unfolded it to reveal two young men squinting in the sun. One was him younger, his face not yet hardened by cruelty. The other was his older brother William, his arms slung casually over Jeb's shoulders. "My brother and I," he'd said, a shadow of something unreadable passing through his eyes. "So you'll know the whole of me." He'd fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin. The gesture had felt like a promise. A sob tore from Eliza's throat, a raw, ragged sound that was swallowed by the immense silence of the desert. The memory was a lie, just like all the others. The locket was not a promise. It was a chain. It was a brand marking her as his. He hadn't cherished her. He had curated her, molded her into the perfect tool for his inscrutable vengeance. She ran harder, the cracked earth of the plains stretching before her like a parched, endless sea. She was running from Red Jeb, but she was also running from the ghost of the man she had once foolishly believed him to be. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that he would never, ever stop coming for her. The sun was a merciless white eye in a bleached blue sky, baking the cracked earth until it split like old leather. It was a land that offered no quarter and made no promises. Caleb Ward understood this landscape because he was a part of it. His face was a road map of sun and wind, his hands calloused and scarred from the unceasing labor of coaxing life from a place that seemed determined to remain barren. His ranch was a testament to his stubborn persistence, a small, sturdy house built of cottonwood and grit, a weathered barn, and a web of fences that stretched toward the hazy, heat-shimmering horizon. It was an empire of isolation, a fortress built not against intruders, but against memories. Here the silence was absolute, broken only by the lowing of his few cattle, or the lonely cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was a silence he had cultivated, a penance he paid each day for a single deafening sound from his past, the sharp, final crack of a pistol that had ended one man's life and irrevocably altered his own. He worked with a methodical, almost mechanical rhythm that left no room for thought. Mend the fence, draw water from the well, check the cattle. Each task was a bead on a rosary of forgetting. Yet the past was a stubborn ghost. Sometimes as he held a hammer or a branding iron, he would stare at his own hands, half expecting to see them stained with something other than dust and sweat. He would see the face of William Brodie, young and arrogant, his eyes wide with surprise in the split second before he fell. The duel had been over a matter of honor, a foolish, prideful affair that had cost everything. It had driven Caleb from his family's wealth and status, sending him into this self-imposed exile where the name Ward meant nothing more than the man who worked this unforgiving patch of dirt. His trips to Redemption Gulch were rare and purely functional, undertaken with a grim efficiency. He would ride in, secure his supplies, and ride out his interactions with the townsfolk, clipped and brief. Today was one of those days. As he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, he could feel the town's nervous energy. People spoke in hushed, urgent tones, their eyes darting toward the savings and loan, its shattered window now boarded up like a fresh wound. Sheriff Tom Avery stood on the boardwalk, his broad frame casting a long shadow. Years of upholding the law in a lawless land had been carved into the weary lines of his face. He saw Caleb and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Ward," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Sheriff." Caleb's reply was equally terse. Avery chewed on the end of an unlit cigar, his gaze fixed on the bank. "Another one. This Red Jeb character? He's not like the usual riffraff. There's a method to his madness, hits hard fast and then vanishes." He paused, turning his shrewd eyes on Caleb. "Funny thing is the places he's been hitting. Miller's Freight Company, the old Bar T Ranch, now the bank. They all used to have dealings with your father back in the day." Caleb's jaw tightened. He offered nothing, his face an unreadable mask. "My father's dealings are in the past. Same as him." "The past has a long shadow." Caleb Avery said, his tone quiet but pointed. "You of all people should know that." Caleb gave a curt nod, collected his sacks of flour and coffee, and left without another word. The sheriff's observation was a stone dropped into the placid, carefully maintained pool of his solitude. The ripples spread, disturbing the ghosts he worked so hard to keep submerged. He mounted his horse and rode out of town, pushing the animal harder than usual, as if he could outrun the shadow Avery had spoken of, the one that seemed to be stretching longer and darker with each passing day. He found her near the river, the last place where a trickle of life still defied the relentless sun. At first he thought she was a bundle of discarded rags, another casualty of the harsh wilderness. Then the bundle moved a pathetic, shuddering motion, and he saw a flash of pale skin and tangled, sweat-matted hair. She was collapsed at the riverbank, her body a canvas of raw wounds and deep, violet bruises. His first instinct was to turn away, to ride on and leave this piece of the world's misery where he found it. Trouble had a scent, and this woman reeked of it. Bringing her to the ranch would be a breach of the walls he had so painstakingly built. But then she lifted her head, and her eyes wide and wild with a terror that went beyond mere pain found his. "Please," she rasped, her voice a dry crackle of sound. Don't touch me. Please don't hurt me." Her words struck a chord deep inside him, a place of old guilt and buried honor. He saw not just a broken woman, but a reflection of his own damnation. He was a man who had brought ruin with his own hands. Perhaps here was a chance, however small, to mend something. He dismounted slowly, his movements calm and deliberate, as if approaching a spooked foal. He kept his eyes averted, granting her the dignity the world had clearly stolen. His jaw tight with a resolve he hadn't felt in years, he unbuttoned his coarse work shirt. He stepped forward and gently draped it over her trembling shoulders. The fabric, still warm from his own body, was a flimsy shield against the world, but it was all he had to offer. She flinched at his proximity but didn't pull away. Her hands came up, clutching the rough cotton as if it were a lifeline. He led his horse to the water to drink, giving her a moment. When he turned back, she was still huddled in the same spot, the oversized shirt swallowing her slight frame. "You're safe now," he said, his voice gruff, unaccustomed to softness. "Breathe." He helped her to her feet, his touch impersonal but firm, supporting her weight as she swayed. On the slow ride back to the ranch, she remained silent, her head bowed, her hands never releasing their desperate grip on his shirt. As he rode, he noticed it for the first time, the thin silver chain around her neck, disappearing into the collar of the shirt. It was an elegant piece, out of place on a woman so destitute. As he helped her down from the horse back at the ranch, the chain shifted and a small silver locket fell into view. It was tarnished and dented, but he could make out a strange stylized insignia engraved on its back, a winding serpent coiled around the letter W. A cold knot formed in his stomach. The design was a grotesque parody a corrupted version of his own family's crest, the Ward brand. He said nothing, his face impassive, but as he settled her into a chair on his porch and went to fetch water and clean bandages, Sheriff Avery's words echoed in his mind. "And the past has a long shadow, Caleb." He had brought her in, this broken woman, with a familiar sigil hanging around her neck. He had thought he was offering shelter from her storm, but a chilling certainty began to dawn on him. He had just invited the storm right into the heart of his sanctuary. He tended to her wounds with a detached efficiency, cleaning the cuts and applying salve to the bruises. She bore it all with a stoic silence, her eyes following his every move, with a hawk's intensity. He gave her broth and water, and as the sun began its slow, bleeding descent across the plains, she finally spoke. Her story came out in broken fragments, a carefully edited tale of a charming man who had turned into a monster. A story of love curdling into possession of beatings and fear culminating in her desperate flight. Caleb listened, his expression unchanging. He recognized the truth in her pain, but he also recognized the omissions. She spoke of him, but never used a name. Her eyes, when she thought he wasn't looking, scanned the horizon, not like a lost soul, but like a scout watching for an enemy patrol. There was a hardness beneath her fragility, a calculated caution that didn't quite fit the part of a simple abused woman. He didn't press her. Not yet. He let her keep her secrets just as he kept his own. 2 days later they came. 2 riders materializing out of the heat haze like malevolent spirits. They didn't ride hard or fast. They approached the ranch with a lazy confidence that was more menacing than any open aggression. Caleb saw them from the barn and felt that familiar cold knot tighten in his gut. He told Eliza to stay inside out of sight before walking out to meet them, his posture relaxed, but his hand never far from the pistol holstered at his hip. The men reined in their horses a respectful distance from the house. The one in the lead, a man with a scarred lip that gave him a permanent sneer, tipped his hat. "Howdy," he drawled, his eyes sweeping over the ranch, cataloging every detail. "We're looking for a stray mare." Figured she might have wandered this way. "No strays here," Caleb said, his voice flat and unwelcoming. The second man, younger and quieter, let his gaze linger on the house. "Nice place you got." "Secluded." His eyes flicked to the barn, where the brand on Caleb's horse was visible, a simple, clean W. Then he looked back at Caleb. "You a Ward?" The question was too direct, too pointed. "This is my land," Caleb answered, deflecting. "That's all you need to know." The scarred man chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Ain't no offense meant, mister. Just heard the Wards used to own half this territory back before they lost their nerve." The insult was deliberate, a hook cast to see if he would bite. Caleb remained impassive. His gaze dropped to the horses the men were riding. On the flank of each animal was a freshly branded mark, the same serpentine W he had seen on Eliza's locket. The pieces were clicking together with terrifying speed. These men weren't looking for a horse. They were scouting. They were hunting. "You've got business elsewhere," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. It was the voice he hadn't used in a decade, the voice from before. "I suggest you see to it." The men exchanged a look. The sneer on the scarred man's face widened. "Sure thing, mister. We'll just be on our way." They turned their horses and trotted off their departure, as unhurried as their arrival. Caleb watched them until they were nothing but small specks against the horizon. He knew with absolute certainty that they would be back. He turned and went back into the house. Eliza was standing by the window, her face pale, her knuckles white where she gripped the windowsill. "They're his men," she whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb nodded grimly. "I know." He looked at her, the fear in her eyes, warring with the steel he knew was underneath. He had to get her out of here. But it was no longer just about her safety. It was about the brand on those horses, the questions about his name, the locket around her neck. Her trouble was no longer just hers. It had followed her here and wrapped its tendrils around the roots of his own buried past. "We're going to town," he said, his decision absolute. "We're going to see the sheriff. This ends now." The ride to Redemption Gulch was a tense, silent affair. Eliza rode with her head down the brim of Caleb's spare hat, hiding her face. But Caleb could feel the weight of the town's stairs as they passed. Trouble always drew a crowd. Sheriff Avery's office smelled of stale coffee-oiled leather and the slow burn of justice. He listened without interruption as Caleb laid out the facts, the arrival of the men, their probing questions, the peculiar brand on their horses. He placed the final piece on the table himself. "The brand," Caleb said, his voice low. "It's the same design as an engraving on a locket she wears." Avery's eyes, heavy-lidded but missing nothing, shifted to Eliza. She flinched, her hand instinctively going to her throat. For the first time, she spoke directly to the lawman, her voice thin but clear. "His name is Jeb. Red Jeb. The brand is his mark. He puts it on everything he claims." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. He looked from Eliza's haunted face to Caleb's granite resolve. "This is getting stickier than a pot of molasses in July," he muttered. "A personal mark. A vendetta against old family names. This ain't just robbery." He ran a hand over his weary face. "All right. She can stay at the boarding house. I'll have my Deputy Miller keep an eye on the place. You and I, Caleb, we're going to do some digging. If Jeb has a pattern, there's a trail, and trails are meant to be followed." The days that followed were a strange purgatory. Eliza was confined to a small, stuffy room at the boarding house, a prisoner for her own protection. Caleb spent the hours with Avery, poring over old maps and property records, tracing the path of Red Jeb's gang. A pattern quickly emerged. Every target, every ranch raided, every freight wagon hit, every business strong-armed had a connection, however tenuous, to the once sprawling influence of the Ward family. It was as if Jeb was systematically erasing his father's legacy from the territory, one violent act at a time. In the evenings, Caleb would visit Eliza. They would sit on the boarding house's narrow porch, the sounds of the town, a distant backdrop to their quiet conversations. He found himself talking more than he had in years, telling her about the ranch and the land, the simple, hard-won satisfaction of a well-mended fence. She in turn began to open up, though her past remained a heavily guarded fortress. She spoke of dreams she once had of a life that didn't involve running. A bond formed between them in those shared silences, a fragile trust built on the common ground of their respective hauntings. He saw the resilience beneath her fear, and she, he suspected, saw the deep well of regret that lay beneath his gruff exterior. Yet a chasm of unspoken truths remained between them. One evening, as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, he looked at her and said, "There's more you're not telling me, Eliza. About him. About why he's doing this." She looked away, her hands twisting the fabric of her skirt. "The less you know about Jeb, the safer you'll be, Caleb. His hate it's an old fire. You don't want to get burned by it." "It seems to me," he replied, his voice soft but insistent, "that I'm already standing in the embers." Her silence was his answer. He knew she was protecting him, but she was also protecting her own secrets that he was beginning to realize were inextricably linked to his own. The feeling that he was a pawn in a game he didn't understand grew stronger with each passing day. He needed an answer, a key to unlock the whole tangled mess. He had a feeling he knew where to find it, back at the ranch, locked away in a dusty trunk, filled with the ghosts of his former life. That night, he rode back to the ranch under the cold, indifferent light of 1,000 stars. The house was cold and empty, the silence no longer comforting, but oppressive. He went to the old steamer trunk that sat at the foot of his bed, a relic from the life he had fled. He hadn't opened it in 10 years. The hinges squealed in protest as he lifted the heavy lid, releasing the musty scent of memories and regret. Inside were the trappings of a different man: tailored suits, leather-bound books, silver-backed hairbrushes. He pushed them aside his hands, searching for a small rosewood box where his father had kept his most important papers. He found it buried beneath a folded dress coat. Inside, among land deeds and letters, was a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings. His father had been obsessed with documenting the family's history and its downfall. He sifted through them until he found the one he was looking for, the one he had tried to burn from his memory. The headline was "Stark Duel at Sunrise, Claims Life of Prominent Heir." The article recounted the unfortunate affair of honor between Caleb Ward, youngest son of the formidable Elias Ward, and William Brody, a rival's son with a hot temper and a loose tongue. It was a sterile, bloodless account of the moment that had cleaved his life in two. He was about to cast it aside when he noticed something on the back. It was a pencil sketch rendered in his father's precise architectural hand. Beneath it, a caption: "The Brody Brothers." A warning. The sketch was of two young men, their faces captured with an artist's eye for character. One was William, his expression arrogant, even in graphite. The other, standing slightly behind him, was younger, with a sly, watchful look in his eyes and the hint of a cruel smile playing on his lips. His heart stopped. The face was older now, harder, but it was unmistakably the same. It was the face of the man the law called Red Jeb, Jebediah Brody. It all crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. The name, the vendetta, the systematic destruction of his family's legacy. This was never about money or power. It was about revenge. A deep, patient, all-consuming revenge for the brother he had shot down in the dust all those years ago. Eliza hadn't stumbled into his life by accident. She was the fuse, and he was the bomb she had been sent to light. He was not a stranger who had offered her shelter. He was the final destination on Red Jeb's map of hatred. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the flimsy piece of newsprint trembling in his hand. The shadow Avery had warned him about had finally caught up. It had a name, and it was coming to collect its due. The revelation settled in Caleb's soul like a shroud of ice. He rode back to town before dawn, and the newspaper clipping a toxic talisman in his pocket. The world looked different now, every shadow menacing every gust of wind, sounding like a whisper of Jebediah Brody's name. He found Sheriff Avery nursing a morning coffee, his face already etched with the day's worries. Caleb didn't speak. He simply unfolded the clipping and placed it on the desk. Avery read the article, then turned it over and studied the sketch. His eyes widened slightly, the only outward sign of his shock. He looked up at Caleb, a decade of unanswered questions finally resolving in his gaze. "Well, I'll be damned," he breathed. "It all makes sense now. The target's the theatrical cruelty of it. This is a ghost story, Caleb, and you're the one being haunted." Before they could discuss it further, the office door flew open. It was Deputy Miller, a young, earnest man, barely old enough to grow a proper mustache. He was breathless, his face pale with alarm. "Sheriff, it's the telegraph line. It's been cut." "And Silas from the livery?" He saw a dozen riders heading out towards the old canyon pass at dawn. They had a hostage. He paused, swallowing hard. They had Deputy Reed. Avery was on his feet in an instant, his weary demeanor replaced by cold, hard authority. The trap was closing. Jeb was isolating the town, cutting them off, raising the stakes. It was a classic outlaw maneuver, but with Jeb it felt like something more, the deliberate setting of a stage. The confirmation came less than an hour later. A lone rider flying no colors galloped into town, dropped a weighted letter onto the boardwalk in front of the sheriff's office, and rode off before anyone could react. The message was brief and brutal. It wasn't addressed to the sheriff. It was addressed to Caleb. Ward, I have your lawman. You have my woman. A poor trade, I think. Let's correct it. Your ranch, sundown. Come alone. JB. The letters JB seemed to burn on the page. Jebediah Brody. He wasn't just coming for Eliza anymore. He was calling Caleb out, demanding he return to the place of his exile to face the ghosts of his past head-on. He was turning Caleb's sanctuary into a stage for the final act of his revenge. Eliza, who had been brought to the office for her own safety, read the note over Caleb's shoulder. A choked gasp escaped her lips. He'll kill him, Caleb. He'll kill that boy, and then he'll come for us. This is the end of his game. Caleb looked at Sheriff Avery. The lawman's face was grim. He wants you alone. That means he wants a duel, not a war. But we can't trust him. He'll have men hidden. Snipers. It's my fight, Tom. Caleb said, his voice quiet but resolute. The time for running was over. The decade of hiding behind the walls of his ranch was at an end. Jeb had forced his hand. It stopped being just your fight when he took my deputy. Avery countered, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. We're going with you. We'll circle around the South Ridge, stay out of sight. But we'll be there. He wants a showdown at your ranch. Fine. We'll give him one. As they prepared to ride out, the sky to the west began to darken the horizon, turning a sickly shade of yellow-gray. The wind picked up, carrying the taste of dust and a low, ominous moan. A storm was coming, a real one to match the tempest of violence that was about to break over Caleb Ward's land. He looked at Eliza, her face a mask of terror, and something else, something he couldn't quite decipher. Whatever secrets she was still keeping, they were about to be scoured away by the coming storm. The world was dissolving. A colossal wall of sand and dust churned up from the guts of the prairie, descended upon the ranch, swallowing the sun and plunging the landscape into a suffocating ochre twilight. The wind howled like a banshee, a physical force that tore at the roof and screamed through every crack in the house. Visibility dropped to mere feet. It was a storm of biblical proportions, a fitting backdrop for the apocalypse Jebediah Brody intended to unleash. Inside the small ranch house, the air was thick with tension. Caleb stood by the window, a Winchester rifle held loosely in his hands, his eyes trying to pierce the swirling chaos outside. Eliza huddled by the cold hearth, wrapped in a blanket, her face ashen. Sheriff Avery and Deputy Miller were with them, their revolvers drawn, their faces grim. The rest of Avery's men were supposedly positioned around the property, but in this maelstrom, they were likely as blind as everyone else. They didn't have to wait long. The first gunshot was a muffled crack, almost lost in the shriek of the wind. Then another closer. They were being tested, probed. Jeb was using the storm as cover, his men moving like phantoms in the dust. A bullet punched through the window, showering the floor with glass and sending Eliza scrambling further into the corner. The fight became a desperate close-quarters affair. Shapes would emerge from the brown haze fire, a shot, and vanish again. Caleb and the lawmen returned fire, their shots aimed at fleeting shadows and muzzle flashes. The house itself groaned under the assault of the wind, the straining of the wood, a constant nerve-wracking counterpoint to the sporadic gunfire. Suddenly, the front door burst inward, ripped from its hinges by a powerful kick. A figure stood silhouetted against the swirling dust, a captured Deputy Reed held in front of him as a human shield. It was Jeb. His duster was caked with dirt, his face grimed with sweat, but his eyes burned with a triumphant, feverish light. "Ward," he bellowed over the roar of the storm. "End of the line. It's just you and me now. The way it should have been with my brother." Sheriff Avery leveled his pistol. "Let the boy go, Brody. It's over." Jeb laughed a harsh, unhinged sound. "It's only over when I say it is." He shoved Deputy Reed to the floor and raised his own pistol, aiming it squarely at Caleb. "You took everything from me, Ward. You shot my brother down in the dirt over some imagined slight, some matter of honor. What honor is there in leaving a boy to watch his hero bleed out? I spent 10 years nursing this hate. I dismantled your father's legacy piece by piece, just so you'd be left with nothing but this pathetic patch of dirt, just so I could take this last thing from you before I send you to hell." The confession hung in the air, a venomous cloud. Caleb stared down the barrel of Jeb's gun, the face of William Brody superimposed over his brother's. The weight of his guilt was a physical pressure on his chest. For a decade, he had seen himself as a man who had made a single tragic mistake. But in Jeb's eyes, he was a monster, a villain, whose story required a bloody end. His finger tightened on the trigger of the Winchester. Avery was shouting something, but the words were lost in the roar of the wind and the blood pounding in his ears. Here was his choice: justice or vengeance. Capture the man who had tormented him or kill him and silence the ghosts for good. He was about to make his choice, to give in to the dark, satisfying pull of retribution, when a scream cut through the din. It was Eliza. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes wild with a desperate, terrible truth. "He's right, Caleb," she cried, her voice cracking with anguish. "Don't you see? I knew who he was all along. I read about the duel, about the last of the Wards living in exile. I sought you out. I led him here. I used you to save myself." The secondary twist hit Caleb harder than any bullet could have. The air left his lungs. He was not her savior. He was her shield. A tool. A pawn in her own desperate game of survival, just as he had been the centerpiece of Jeb's crusade of hate. The revelation paralyzed him. The woman he had started to care for, the man he was about to kill, both had manipulated him, their lives and lies, tangled around the single bloody moment of his past. He was the fulcrum on which all their pain and desperation turned. That split second of stunned hesitation was all Deputy Miller needed. The young lawman, recovering from his fall, lunged, tackling Jeb at the knees. The shot from Jeb's pistol went wide, burying itself in the ceiling. Before Jeb could recover, Avery was on him, the heavy barrel of his revolver connecting with Jeb's temple with a sickening thud. The outlaw crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The shootout was over. But for Caleb, the true battle had just begun. As if on cue, the wind began to subside. The banshee's shriek softened to a mournful sigh, and the blinding curtain of dust started to settle, revealing the wreckage outside. The storm had passed, leaving a strange, ringing silence in its wake. Jeb's men were rounded up, either wounded or surrendering in the face of the now visible deputies. The immediate danger was gone, but the room was thick with the fallout of fractured truths. Jeb was bound and hauled away, a smear of blood on his temple. Sheriff Avery clapped a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You did the right thing, son," he said, but Caleb barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on Eliza. She stood trembling, her confession hanging between them like a shroud. The betrayal was a fresh, gaping wound, more painful than any he had ever received. He had let her in, not just into his home, but into the barricaded fortress of his life. And she had entered under false pretenses, carrying the enemy's flag. After Avery had led his men and their prisoners away, leaving an eerie quiet on the ravaged ranch, Caleb finally turned to face her fully. His voice when he spoke was hollow. "Why?" Tears streamed down her face, carving clean paths through the grime. Her story tumbled out, a raw, desperate litany of fear. After William's death, Jebediah had changed. His grief had festered into a poisonous obsession. He'd taken her in, but his protection became possession. He'd filled her head with his own twisted version of the story, painting Caleb as a cold-blooded murderer who had destroyed his family. She became a part of his vengeance, a living relic of his brother's life that he controlled completely. I was so scared, she sobbed, her words fragmented. He was going to kill me. I knew he would eventually. I saw your name in an old newspaper. The story of the duel. I saw you as a legend, a killer. I thought only a man like that could stop a man like him. It wasn't just to save myself, Caleb. It was because I thought you were the only one who could. It was wrong. I know it was wrong. But I didn't know what else to do. He listened, the anger inside him slowly being replaced by a profound, weary sadness. She hadn't been a conspirator. She had been another victim, a piece in Jeb's cruel game, trying to escape by playing a desperate game of her own. He was not the hero she had imagined, and she was not the damsel he had believed her to be. They were just two broken people caught in the same decade-long echo of a single gunshot. He didn't offer forgiveness. He didn't have it to give. He simply nodded, the gesture heavy with exhaustion. "The storm's over, Eliza," he said, his gaze turning to the wrecked doorway and the debris-strewn land beyond. "Now comes the cleanup." Later that evening, Sheriff Avery stopped by on his way back to town. He and Caleb sat on the splintered porch, sharing a flask of whiskey as the first stars appeared in the washed clean sky. "Vengeance is a hungry ghost," Caleb Avery said, his voice laced with the wisdom of a man who had seen too much. "It eats the living, not the dead. Brody let it eat him alive for 10 years. Don't you let your guilt do the same to you." Caleb took a long pull from the flask, the liquor burning a welcome trail down his throat. He looked out at his broken ranch, his shattered solitude. He didn't know if he could forgive Eliza or if he could ever truly forgive himself. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt the faintest glimmer of a possibility that perhaps the cleanup wasn't something he had to do alone. Months passed. The relentless cycle of the seasons began its slow work of healing the land. The harsh winds of autumn gave way to the cold, quiet blanket of winter, which in turn yielded to the tentative green shoots of spring. The ranch bore the scars of the sandstorm, but it was no longer a ruin. The front door was new, the window replaced. The splintered fence posts had been mended. Slowly, painstakingly, life was being rebuilt. The silence on the ranch was different now. It was no longer the oppressive, self-imposed silence of exile, but a peaceful, shared quiet. A letter had arrived from Sheriff Avery a month after the showdown, informing Caleb that Jebediah Brody had been tried, convicted, and hanged. The final sentence of his hate-filled story had been written. The news brought not triumph, but a quiet, somber closure. One clear spring morning, Caleb walked to a quiet corner of his property under the shade of a lone, resilient oak tree. There, he had placed a simple, unmarked wooden cross in the earth. It was a grave for a ghost. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. He had found it on the floor after the fight, its chain broken. He clicked it open. The faded picture of the two Brody brothers, William and Jebediah, stared up at him. Two young men caught in a moment before pride and vengeance had set them on a path to ruin. He looked at their faces for a long moment, then snapped the locket shut. He dug a small hole at the foot of the cross and placed the locket inside, covering it with earth. It was a burial, an act of forgiveness for William, for Jeb, and finally for himself. He straightened up and turned. Eliza was standing a short distance away, giving him his space. She hadn't left. In the weeks following the storm, she had stayed expecting him to ask her to go at any moment. He never did, and she in turn never asked for permission to stay. Instead, she had simply begun to work. She helped him rebuild the fence, learned to tend the small vegetable patch she had started near the house, and filled the quiet corners of the ranch with a gentle, determined presence. Her penance was not in words, but in deeds. She was building a new life, with her own 2 hands, right alongside him. He walked over to her. The chasm of her betrayal had not vanished, but they had spent the intervening months building a bridge across it, plank by quiet plank of shared work and mutual understanding. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small paper packet. "The soil's good here," he said, his voice even as he handed her the packet of corn seeds. She took them, her fingers brushing against his. A simple touch, but it held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words of forgiveness and acceptance. She gave him a small, genuine smile, the kind he had not seen since before the storm, the smile of someone who saw a future worth holding on to. Together they stood and looked out over the land, their land. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the greening plains. Their pasts would always be a part of them, the scars a reminder of the storms they had weathered. But they were no longer defined by them. They were 2 survivors who had found in each other not a perfect salvation, but something far more real and resilient, a shared chance to plant seeds in the hard-won soil of a new beginning.